Hi, welcome my channel. Evelyn Mercer inherits an empire. But betrayal lurks. Can she outsmart her enemies and reclaim her legacy? Let's dive in. The room was suffocatingly silent as the lawyer, Mr. Langford, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Every seat in the grand mahogany-lined conference hall of Cunningham and Rhodes law firm was occupied by members of the Mercer family, key executives, and several board members of Mercer Global, all waiting for the reading of Harrison Mercer's will. A chill ran down Evelyn Mercer's spine as she sat between distant relatives who had never cared for her before but now watched her with calculating eyes. She hadn't even fully processed the loss of her grandfather, the only person in her family who had truly believed in her. And yet she was already in the middle of a battlefield. Her mother's estranged siblings, led by her aunt Veronica Sinclair, sat poised, waiting for the inevitable confirmation that she, as Harrison's eldest surviving child, would inherit everything. Gregory Sinclair, her uncle by marriage, sat beside Veronica, exuding an air of smug confidence, as if he had already assumed control over Mercer Global. Evelyn didn't care much for the family politics. But she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let them bully her into the shadows. She straightened her posture, her hands resting steadily on the polished oak table. Whatever happened next, she would not let them see her falter. Mr. Langford unfolded the document with practiced precision and began reading in a firm, unwavering tone. The first few minutes were routine: the bequests, the charity donations, and the division of various minor assets. Veronica smiled in satisfaction when she was granted a vacation estate in France, and Gregory received a luxury yacht. But then the lawyer's tone shifted slightly, signaling the part that truly mattered: the company. Evelyn held her breath, gripping the armrests of her chair. As per the final wishes of Mr. Harrison Mercer, Mr. Langford announced, the entirety of Mercer Global, including all controlling shares, properties, and financial assets, shall be inherited by his granddaughter, Evelyn Mercer. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, Evelyn thought she had misheard. The weight of the words pressed down on her, heavy with the realization of what they meant. She was now the sole owner of one of the most powerful financial consulting firms in the country. But before she could even process it, a sharp intake of breath broke the stillness. Veronica shot up from her seat so fast that her chair nearly toppled over. That must be a mistake, she snapped, her voice shrill with disbelief. Harrison wouldn't do this. He intended for the company to remain with the family. She turned to the lawyer, as if daring him to contradict her. Mr. Langford remained composed, merely adjusting his spectacles before replying evenly. I assure you, Mrs. Sinclair, there is no mistake. This will was updated and finalized 3 months ago, in full accordance with the law. Gregory let out a slow, incredulous chuckle. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head as if this were all some elaborate joke. Sweetheart, he said, turning his gaze toward Evelyn, his tone thick with condescension. Running a business of this magnitude isn't like managing some university project. You don't have the experience. His words dripped with mock concern. But Evelyn saw the thinly veiled fury behind his eyes. This was not part of their plan. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the room, observing the way everyone was reacting. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some clearly surprised, others merely confirming what they already suspected. They knew. Evelyn's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a will reading. This had been orchestrated long before her grandfather passed. They had all assumed Veronica would inherit the company and hand it over to Gregory. That was the plan. Evelyn was never supposed to be a factor in their equation. Yet, here she was, the only legal heir. Veronica's expression darkened, her carefully maintained poise slipping as she realized that arguing wouldn't change the facts. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to Evelyn, her lips curling into something resembling a smirk. If that's how it is, she said, her voice low and icy. Then get out. Evelyn blinked. Excuse me? You heard me, Veronica said. If you're taking the company, then you can leave. This is our house. Evelyn stared at her for a beat before tilting her head slightly. A slow, amused smirk pulled at her lips before she could stop it. Our house? She echoed softly. Then, shaking her head, she let out a quiet laugh. You might want to take another look at that will. Aunt Veronica, because I have a feeling there's more bad news waiting for you. Mr. Langford cleared his throat again, his tone utterly professional. As per Mr. Mercer's final testament, the Mercer estate is also to be inherited by Evelyn Mercer. If the silence before had been heavy, the one that followed was suffocating. Every set of eyes locked onto her, some with shock, others with barely restrained fury. Veronica's fingers curled into fists at her sides. Her jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Gregory flicked his gaze between Evelyn and the lawyer, his previously assured confidence cracking at the edges. They had expected total control, and instead, they had been cut out completely. Evelyn could almost hear her grandfather's voice in the back of her mind. They will come for it. And when they do, don't be afraid. I've made sure you're ready. She hadn't understood what he meant at the time. But now, watching her aunt and uncle unravel before her eyes, she finally did. She had just declared war. Evelyn sat alone in her grandfather's study, the weight of his final words pressing down on her like an iron chain. The room still smelled of his favorite cedarwood cologne. The grand bookshelves towering around her, filled with decades of knowledge and wisdom he had spent his life accumulating. She ran her fingers over the smooth wooden desk, remembering the countless evenings she had sat across from him, listening to his stories about business, strategy, and the importance of legacy. They will try to take what I built. Do not let them, he had whispered, his voice frail but sharp with urgency. At the time, she hadn't fully grasped what he meant. Now, she did. As she replayed the moment from the will reading, she realized the betrayal hadn't started that day. It had been orchestrated long before her grandfather's passing. For years, her Aunt Veronica and Uncle Gregory had played a careful, patient game, weaving their influence through Mercer Global like a slow-growing vine. They had been grooming the board members, ensuring that when Harrison Mercer passed, Veronica would inherit control, only to sign it over to Gregory, making him the de facto leader of the billion-dollar empire. Evelyn could see it so clearly now, the hushed conversations, the way Gregory had casually belittled her at family gatherings, the way Veronica had dismissed her ambitions with a patronizing smile. They had never seen her as a threat, only as an inconvenience they needed to push aside. The most chilling part? No one in the company had flinched when Veronica declared Gregory as the new head of Mercer Global. Not the executives, not the board members, not even the longtime family friends who had known Evelyn since childhood. It was as if her ownership had been nothing more than a legal technicality. An obstacle that would soon be corrected. She wasn't just fighting her relatives, she was up against a carefully built network of power, alliances, and silent agreements that had been formed long before she had even entered the picture. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. They had always planned to erase her. But the one thing they hadn't counted on was Harrison Mercer himself. Unlike them, he had seen her potential, not as a pawn, but as his successor, while Gregory and Veronica had assumed that the family name alone would grant them power. Harrison had taught Evelyn something they had never bothered to learn: how to fight for it. Every summer she had spent shadowing him at Mercer Global. Every meeting she had attended in silence. Every financial report he had handed her with a knowing look. He had been preparing her. He had known this day would come. And he had made sure she was ready. Her fists clenched at the thought. They had underestimated her. They thought they could scare her, manipulate her, force her into compliance. But they were wrong. Her grandfather had left her everything, not just the company, but the tools to protect it. He had seen through their deception. And now, so did she. As she sat in the dim glow of his study, her pulse steadied. This was no longer about family disputes or inheritance battles. This was about proving that she was more than just a name on a legal document. This was about taking back what was hers. And she had no intention of letting them win. Evelyn barely had time to process the full scope of her inheritance before the war for control began. The very next morning, she received an invitation, a private meeting with her Aunt Veronica and Uncle Gregory at one of Mercer Global's top-floor conference rooms. It was an obvious power play. Their way of making it clear that they still believed themselves to be the ones in charge. Despite knowing the meeting was a trap, Evelyn accepted. She wasn't naive, she needed to hear their strategy firsthand, to see exactly how they planned to push her out. As she entered the sleek glass-walled office, She wasn't surprised to find them already seated at the long conference table. Gregory exuding an air of unearned confidence while Veronica studied her with cold calculation. "Evelyn, darling," Veronica greeted smoothly, her voice carefully composed. "You must be feeling overwhelmed. We completely understand." She gestured to the chair across from her, as if inviting a child to sit down. Evelyn didn't move. She had seen this act before, the feigned concern, the patronizing tone, the illusion of kindness masking an iron fist. Gregory leaned back in his chair, offering a smirk. "We're here to help, sweetheart," he added. "Running a company like Mercer Global isn't like running a school club. It requires real experience." His emphasis on the word real was deliberate, a subtle jab at her perceived incompetence. Evelyn finally sat, but she remained silent, letting them speak first. She had learned from her grandfather that in negotiations, the first one to talk is usually the one with the weaker hand. Veronica, clearly expecting Evelyn to protest, continued, "You are, of course, the legal heir, but you must realize that leadership takes more than just a name on a document." Gregory leaned forward, his fingers laced together on the table. "We have a solution," he said, his voice dripping with practiced charm. "A partnership." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "A partnership?" Gregory nodded, his smirk widening. "You would still be the public face of Mercer Global, the young, inspiring heiress. But I would handle the day-to-day operations. The real work. You'd still be CEO in name. But you wouldn't have to deal with all the pressure, all the responsibility." Ah, there it was, the real offer. They didn't want her out entirely, they just wanted a puppet. They wanted her to sit quietly while they pulled the strings. Evelyn let the silence stretch, watching them closely. They thought she was a fool. They thought they could scare her into compliance, convince her to sign over her power so they could rule from the shadows. She could see it in Gregory's eyes, he believed he had already won. And that's when she smiled. "A partnership," she mused, tilting her head. "So, let me get this straight, the moment you realized the company wasn't yours, you tried to throw me out of my own home. And now, just hours later, you want me to believe that you and Gregory should be the ones in charge?" She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Do I really look that gullible?" Gregory's smirk faltered, just slightly. "This isn't about power, Evelyn. It's about what's best for the company." "Right," Evelyn said, her voice laced with amusement. "And you think handing it over to you is what's best?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Veronica's expression darkened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You're playing a dangerous game," she warned. "If you refuse to work with us, the board will turn against you. Investors will doubt you. You'll be left completely alone." Evelyn didn't blink. "Are you threatening me?" Gregory let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Not at all," he said smoothly. "We're giving you an opportunity to make the smart choice before things get complicated." There it was, the ultimatum: work with them, or they would turn the company against her. Evelyn inhaled slowly, steadying her heartbeat. She had known this wouldn't be easy. She had expected a fight, she just hadn't expected them to be this desperate this quickly. They had already lost legal control, and now they were scrambling to regain power by force, by manipulation, by any means necessary. She let the silence stretch again before pushing back her chair and standing. "I appreciate the offer," she said, keeping her voice calm, "but I think I'll take my chances." Veronica's lips curled into a sneer. "You'll regret this." Evelyn met her gaze with unwavering confidence. "We'll see." As she walked out of the room, she didn't look back. She could feel their eyes burning into her back, feel the barely restrained fury simmering beneath their polished facades. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. They had just declared war on her leadership, and she was ready for it. Evelyn barely had a moment to breathe before the attacks began. The morning after her confrontation with Veronica and Gregory, the headlines hit like a well-coordinated ambush. Mercer Global in crisis. Can an inexperienced heiress handle the empire? Market in turmoil as new CEO lacks business acumen. The articles were brutal, dissecting her age, lack of experience, and the supposed recklessness of Harrison Mercer's decision to entrust the company to her. Evelyn scrolled through the news on her phone, her stomach tightening as financial analysts and anonymous corporate insiders speculated about the company's imminent downfall under her leadership. They painted her as a naive, privileged child, someone who had been handed power without earning it. It wasn't hard to figure out who was behind the smear campaign. This was Gregory's work, a carefully orchestrated attempt to erode her credibility before she even had the chance to prove herself. But that wasn't the worst of it. By noon, Mercer Global's stock prices had begun to drop, rattling investors and fueling speculation that the company was unstable under Evelyn's leadership. Within hours, board members were whispering among themselves, their confidence in her visibly shaken. Some had already been influenced by Gregory, subtly encouraged to push for a vote of no confidence. At first, Evelyn felt an icy stab of panic. This was happening too fast. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected them to strike so quickly and so publicly. Every move she made was suddenly under a microscope. The media, the investors, and even her own board were beginning to question whether she belonged in the CEO's chair. Then, the first direct attack came, a leaked financial report, anonymously sent to news outlets, claiming that Mercer Global had been in financial decline for months, a supposed result of Harrison Mercer's failing judgment in his final years. It was a lie, twisted from half-truths and carefully manipulated data, but it was effective. That evening, as Evelyn sat in her office overlooking the city, her phone buzzed with calls from worried executives, desperate for reassurance. The smear campaign was working. She knew she had to act fast. With Damian Holt, her grandfather's former business partner and most trusted advisor, she began tracking the sources of the leaks, cross-referencing who had the most to gain from destabilizing Mercer Global. As expected, the trail led straight back to Gregory. He hadn't just fed false reports to the media, he had been deliberately manipulating the company from within, stirring doubts among investors and painting Evelyn as a liability. He had counted on her to panic, to be overwhelmed into stepping aside. But Evelyn wasn't about to play into his hands. Instead of retreating, she reached out to her most trusted allies, key investors who still held loyalty to her grandfather and financial analysts who knew the truth about the company's stability. By the next morning, she launched a counter-offensive, securing a high-profile interview to set the record straight. Evelyn knew she couldn't simply deny the accusations, she had to prove herself. As she prepared to go public, she understood one thing clearly: Gregory and Veronica weren't just trying to take her company, they were trying to destroy her reputation. But if they thought she was going down without a fight, they had made a critical mistake. Evelyn sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table in Mercer Global's executive boardroom, her fingers resting lightly against the polished wood. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the silent challenge in the air. Around her sat the board members, men and women who had worked under her grandfather for decades, now uncertain whether she was fit to lead. At the far end of the table, Gregory Sinclair, ever the opportunist, leaned back in his chair with an air of smug anticipation. He was certain this meeting would mark the end of her leadership. The moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived, a formal vote of no confidence, meant to remove her from the position of CEO and place him in power. Mr. Holloway, one of the most senior board members, cleared his throat. "Before we move forward with the vote," he said, adjusting his glasses, "Miss Mercer, do you have anything to say in your defense?" His tone was neutral, but Evelyn could hear the doubt beneath the professionalism. They had been fed lies, manipulated by Gregory and Veronica's campaign, and now they were ready to cast her aside without a second thought. She could feel Damian Holt's presence beside her, the only person in the room who truly had her back. He had spent the last 72 hours gathering evidence, tracing the media leaks, uncovering every dirty trick Gregory had played. Evelyn exhaled slowly, then met each board member's gaze one by one. It was time to turn the tables. "Actually," she said, her voice calm but commanding, "before you vote on my removal, I think you should take a look at some documents that might change your minds." She gestured to Damian, who slid a thick folder of evidence across the table. The board members hesitated before flipping through the pages. Within seconds, expressions of confusion turned to shock. "What is this?" one of them muttered, frowning. "Proof," Evelyn said smoothly, leaning forward, Proof that Gregory Sinclair has been actively working against Mercer Global. You see, this wasn't just about questioning my leadership. It was about sabotaging the company from the inside. She let her words sink in before continuing. I know some of you were concerned about the negative press surrounding me. That's understandable. What you don't know is that those articles were leaked by Gregory himself. She turned her gaze to him, watching his smirk falter for the first time. We traced the media leaks back to a private email account. She continued, an account registered under your name. Gregory. A stunned silence filled the room. That's absurd. Gregory finally snapped, his voice tight with barely concealed fury. You can't possibly. Oh, but I can. Evelyn cut in, her tone razor sharp. I have emails, financial records, and even recorded conversations proving that you leaked confidential company documents to the press. All to create the illusion that Mercer Global was crumbling under my leadership. She reached into the folder and pulled out printed transcripts of phone calls, sliding them toward Mr. Holloway. If you turn to page 5, you'll see a conversation where Gregory discusses intentionally stirring investor panic to force a leadership change. The room erupted into murmurs. Shock and betrayal thick in the air. Veronica's face paled, her carefully constructed poise slipping. Gregory clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair as he desperately tried to regain control. This is nothing more than an elaborate smear campaign against me, he sneered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Evelyn smirked. Now it was his turn to feel powerless. I suppose that's one way to look at it, she said, tilting her head. But unfortunately for you, the legal team has already verified the authenticity of these documents. So unless you'd like to argue with forensic experts, I'd suggest you reconsider your position. Veronica suddenly stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous, she hissed. Evelyn, you don't understand the consequences of what you're doing. You think you've won? The investors will still turn on you. The company will still fall apart. You're just a child playing CEO. Evelyn's gaze sharpened, the fury bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She had spent her entire life being told she was too young, too inexperienced, too unworthy, and yet, here she was, standing stronger than ever, while they were the ones scrambling to hold on to their illusion of control. You're wrong, Evelyn said simply. I am not a child. And this is not a game. This is my company, and as of today, neither of you have any place in it. She turned toward the board members. I believe it's time to vote on my leadership, she said. Mr. Holloway, now visibly furious at Gregory's deception, nodded, agreed. One by one, the hands rose in her favor. The final count? Unanimous. Evelyn Mercer was officially recognized as the rightful CEO of Mercer Global. Security was called within minutes. Gregory, his face now flushed with rage, refused to stand. You can't do this, he shouted. You think you're untouchable? You'll regret this. Evelyn, you have no idea how this world works. Evelyn met his glare with steady confidence. I know enough, she said simply. As security escorted Gregory and Veronica out of the boardroom, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in days, relief. They had tried to break her, to strip her of everything her grandfather had built. But they had failed. The war wasn't over yet, but today, she had won the first major battle. The silence that followed Gregory and Veronica's expulsion from the boardroom was deafening. For the first time since her grandfather's passing, Evelyn Mercer felt the weight of uncertainty lift from her shoulders. She had won, against all odds, against the scheming, the manipulation, the media smear campaign, and the corporate backstabbing. She had held her ground. As she sat back in her chair, the realization settled in. Mercer Global was truly hers. She glanced around the table, where the same board members who had once doubted her now regarded her with a newfound sense of respect. Even Mr. Holloway, who had initially questioned her leadership, gave her an approving nod. She had earned this. Outside the boardroom, security escorted Gregory and Veronica through the gleaming halls of Mercer Global, their protests and threats ringing hollow. Gregory, still red-faced with fury, swore that Evelyn had made a mistake. You think this is over? He snarled. You have no idea what you're up against. But his threats no longer fazed her. Veronica, on the other hand, remained eerily quiet, her carefully cultivated composure cracking at the edges. She had spent years believing she was entitled to this empire, convinced that power was her birthright. But power wasn't inherited, it was earned. And today, Evelyn had proved she was the one who had earned it. As she walked back to her office, Damien Holt followed, his usual smirk softer than usual. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Not bad, kid, he said. Your grandfather would be proud. Evelyn let out a slow breath, allowing a small smile to form. It wasn't just about proving herself to the board, it was about proving herself to him. To the man who had believed in her from the start. Thanks, Damien, she said, for everything. He shrugged. Don't mention it. Now, go celebrate. You just took down two of the most ruthless people in this business. 1 year later, Evelyn stood at the podium, addressing a packed room of investors, executives, and media personnel. The past year had been filled with challenges, restructuring, and rebuilding Mercer Global's reputation. But she had done it. The company wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. She glanced down at the polished surface of the podium, her fingers trailing over the engraving of the Mercer Global emblem. Her company, her legacy. She took a deep breath and looked out at the expectant faces before her. When my grandfather chose me to lead Mercer Global, people doubted me, she began, her voice strong and steady. They called it a gamble. They said I was too young, too inexperienced. They said I would fail. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Then, with quiet confidence, she added, they were wrong. The crowd erupted into applause, cameras flashing as Evelyn stood tall, her place at the helm of Mercer Global now undeniable. She hadn't just survived, she had won. And now, she was the story of Evelyn Mercer teaches a powerful lesson about resilience, self-belief, and the true nature of leadership. Power isn't inherited, it's earned through perseverance, intelligence, and courage. Despite facing betrayal, manipulation, and sabotage, Evelyn refused to be a pawn in someone else's game. She learned that success isn't about proving others wrong, it's about proving yourself right. Her journey highlights the importance of strategic thinking, standing firm against adversity, and trusting in one's own abilities. In the end, she didn't just inherit a legacy, she built one of her own. True strength lies in facing challenges head-on and refusing to back down.